Right, continuing with my reading of my pamphlet, Academies, Failing Schools for Corporate Profit. Right, and now I get to the section on the Academy's refusal to take difficult pupils. Conditions for pupils may not improve either, especially for children with behaviour problems. Academies have tried to keep up their appearance of improving standards, frequently by excluding some of the most difficult children, who may find their school career and their entire lives wrecked as a result. One school managed to exclude 246 or so of its student population of 700 odd. Beckett provides a couple of cases showing what happened to some of the unlucky children who were expelled, except that technically they may not be. They can exclude someone in a particular manner, so there is not technically an exclusion, and if it's not technically an exclusion, then the local educational authority does not have the statutory responsibility to find another school for them. This happened to a lad, Jack, not his real name, whose case is dealt with in Francis Beckett's book, The Great City Academy Fraud, London Continuum 2007. Jack was excluded and effectively confined to home for 5 months. The lad suffered from depression anyway, which was made worse. His mother reported that he then spent all his time in his room, not coming out even for his meals. Another boy who was excluded also found that no one else was prepared to take him on. He ended up not doing his GCSEs. He did manage to get a vocational qualification at a local college. But as this is not an academic qualification, he will suffer at finding a job and be unable to get into university. And it isn't exactly fun and games for the teachers either. They're frequently only hired on 6 months contracts, just in case they start getting a bit too settled and a bit too powerful. One woman was assaulted by a boy in her class. He was not expelled, and the woman understandably felt anxious about going back to work. So she took a little bit more time off, only to find that, as she was on a 6-month contract, she was not paid for the extra time. No choice for parents and local authorities. And parents and local authorities have been penalised if they refuse to get in line and on message with the Blairite diktats. Local authorities are expected to consider building academies when trying to renovate and improve schools in their areas. And the onus is always on changing to an academy. If a local authority refuses the government's command to turn their school into one, the government responded with a scorched earth policy. No further money would be forthcoming for that area's schools. And Blair was both doctrinaire and personally vindictive towards those schools that refused to bend or stubbornly remained good in Ofsted reports. Documents revealed under the Freedom of Information Act show that Islington Green School, which Blair was desperate to close, was actually rated good by the school inspectors, despite Chris Woodhead, the then head of Ofsted, declaring that it was failing. There then followed a long campaign to have the school closed and transformed into an academy. Quite why is unknown, but Beckett speculates personal spite on the warmonger's part. The Blairs lived in his catchment area, but they sent their children over the other side of London to be educated at the London Oratory. The press seized on this, and the dear leader was embarrassed. So it looks like the school was failed for political reasons, to make it seem less like Blair wasn't sending his children to it purely for reasons of personal snobbery. In other areas, parents were subject to the full set of New Labour spin and vilification if they put up protests against plans to close their schools and turn them into academies. One man, who was part of a campaign to save his local school, came under personal attack in the subsequent court case to save the school from closure. He was a member of the Socialist Party, which is what used to be the militant tendency when he was part of the Labour Party. And so New Labour seized on that and claimed that he was only opposing the academy plan because of his political opinions. Not true, but that was how the local New Labour Party spun it. Their Labour MP also sent out a very carefully worded letter to her constituents that asked them to tick 2 boxes. One said they were in favour of raising school standards involving a transfer to academy status. The other box said that they were not in favour of raising standards through academy status, or something like that. It was carefully phrased to make it sound like the only way to improve standards was through changing to an academy. If you weren't behind it, You weren't in favour of improving school standards. It was the new Labour educational variety of the old leading question: do you still beat your wife? Academies and the curriculum. There are also major concerns about what academies actually teach. Beckett writes from a secular viewpoint and is very sceptical about the involvement of the churches and evangelical groups in running schools. He states that there may be a democratic argument to be put forward in favour of handing schools over to religious organisations, but this has not been made. Instead, he cites quotes from Peter Vardy and the Roman Catholic spokesman for education in Scotland, McGrath, who regret that churches have relinquished schools to the state. He shows how the churches, including the Church of England, are trying to get into education with the aim of indoctrinating a new generation of believers. Beckett isn't entirely opposed to religious involvement in schooling. He has nothing against the traditional compromise in which schools offered religious education and an act of daily worship, but were otherwise left to get on with things. But the religious character of some of these schools does become a problem, such as their refusal to employ staff of a different faith, or when most of their pupils are non-Christians such as Muslims, or when the Christian ethos is expected to get down into lessons like pottery. Peter Vardy and his organisation are a matter of considerable concern because of Vardy's determination to teach creationism as an acceptable scientific theory, which has been criticised by the Royal Society amongst others. It is not just the religious organisations that present problems with the subjects taught at academies. Sponsors are also able to set the curriculum, and so this reflects the particular interests of the businessman or organisation sponsoring the academy. In academies run by particular firms, the emphasis may be on those skills the firm requires, even though several of them have denied that they are in fact doing so. Beckett makes the point that these firms are effectively training the worker bees of industry for tomorrow. When the sponsor is a sports club, the academy, naturally enough, specialises in sport. The result is that subjects like technology and business are favourite subjects with sponsors, but ordinary, valuable subjects like English, maths and languages, for which there is also a need, are much less well represented. Driving down other schools. Beckett also describes how academies also work to drive down the other schools in their areas. Academies may receive massive funding from the government, like 37 million, or something like 2 to 6 million may be granted to maintain the other state schools in the area. Academies may thus become the favourite choice for parents. They are also highly selective. There is evidence, that very many of the academies expel difficult pupils, thus passing them on to the conventional state sector. Many of them also opt to select 10% of their intake according to ability, or they may choose to take them by banding. In this instance, children are divided into 3 bands of above average, average and below average educational performance capacity. Schools following this method of selection take equal numbers of all of the above bands. However, as academies were designed to raise standards in areas where there may be considerable deprivation, the lowest bands may fill up very rapidly because of the way poverty brings down educational performance and expectations. So the new academy doesn't take on all the failing pupils in its deprived areas. Several of these academies in deprived inner cities targeted not local parents, but those further out in the leafy suburbs, who could be expected to be more affluent and send brighter, more capable pupils to their schools. The poorer performing schools doing well in spite of disadvantages, and some of the schools that were declared failing and slated to be turned into academies actually were performing very well under circumstances over which they had no control. One of these schools, for example, was in an area where there was a large number of refugee children, none of whom were fluent in English. This school, however, had high staff morale and provided value for money in the considerable improvement it made on these children's grades from a very low base. This was before value was taken into consideration, however, and Blair and his minions decided the school wasn't performing well enough. No improvement over state schools. It is also very unclear whether academies provide any value for money or improvement over conventional state schools. The stats for 2005 show that at one time, 11 out of 14 academies were in the bottom 200 schools. Where they did improve, it was quite often through transferring the less academically able pupils from GCSEs to GNVQs which count as for GCSEs in the stats. When this is accounted for, the supposed superior performance of academies simply vanishes. And some of the improvements are simply achieved because vast sums of money were thrown at failing schools. Any school would have been improved under these circumstances, and it's a good question whether these schools would have improved more if they had been under proper LEA control. Academies and cash for honours and Tony. Oh yes, New Labour said it was very relaxed about being rich. The approaches New Labour made to the individuals that Tony Blair took on board to sponsor the academies was also suspect. As with so much Blairite New Labour, there was more than a whiff of corruption about this. Money changed hands so that sponsors could get a seat in the House of Lords or some other honour. One member of the department dealing with setting up the academies found the full force of the law when he was caught in a sting operation by the Sunday Times. He had supposedly offered a lady journalist, posing as a potential sponsor, the possibility of various honours. He was then arrested at 7:30 in the morning and flung in jail on potential corruption charges, his career in government at an end. Meanwhile, the Blairite spin machine went into overdrive with various Blairites, including David Miliband, declaring that no such sale was taking place. But politics was deeply involved, and as many of those sponsoring academies had made generous donations and loans to the New Labour Party. Several of them were under investigation by the Rozzers. Even in the first years of the new millennium, however, they weren't all donors to New Labour. Several were supporters of and donors to the Conservative Party, including one evangelical businessman who gave the Tory party the use of his business premises and staff free of charge. When it came to using the same premises as part of the preparations for changing the targeted school into an academy, this particular businessman made sure that the taxpayer paid the full whack for his company's services. End of part 2.